There we go. Thanks. First, we're going to go into new developments in commonly used substances. And then we're going to get into some of the newer emerging substances, some of which you may have heard of before, some that might be kind of new to you. Um, and a lot of these emerging substances are not prevalent really among youth yet. So these might be things that young people or parents or community members might ask you about because they hear about it on the news or they've saw some story about it, but not super prevalent within the teen population yet, but still things that we want to be aware of. And then finally, we'll talk about our response as preventionists and people who work in this field, which is early comprehensive prevention, kind of ending on a hopeful note that though the drug and new substances landscape kind of changes continually, what we're doing upstream to try to prevent substance use is the same, no matter what substances we're concerned about. So I'm just going to jump right into it. If you have questions as I'm going through, please feel free to use the chat and I'll hopefully have some time at the end to get to them. But this first section is newer developments in some commonly used substances. And so the first one that we just want to touch on, I think we're all aware that this is a new trend, is synthetic oral nicotine products. These are increasingly popular among youth. So these would be oral nicotine products that are made in a lab, and they don't necessarily come from the tobacco plant. These would be nicotine pouches, gum, lozenges, tablets, gummies. There's a whole host of different kinds. These are not the prescribed therapies that are approved for smoking cessation. They come in flavors and have very kind of candy-like packaging, so they're very attractive to young people. Um, Many of them make health claims and advertise being tobacco-free. And the reason that they can advertise being tobacco-free is because they're made with nicotine salts and these synthetic nicotine um, chemicals. So they're not coming from the tobacco plant, which does make regulation more difficult for these. They're very high in nicotine content and they can be pretty discreet, which is why they're popular among young people. And so we know that as government restrictions on tobacco products, vapes, things like that are increasing, tobacco industry is responding by putting a lot of time and effort into these oral products because they offer a loophole to get around some of that regulation. And so since this doesn't come directly from the tobacco plant, the regulations governing the manufacture, sale, and marketing of tobacco and tobacco-derived products doesn't apply to these. You'll see these pop up on social media a lot where kids can learn about them, unfortunately. So when it comes to nicotine pouches, this is a modern twist on, if you think about kind of chewing tobacco from that was popular. At least I'm from the South. It was popular in the South. But this is smokeless, spitless, and tobacco-free, with kind of that more traditional smokeless tobacco, chewing tobacco, someone putting a lip in. The user needed to spit out that really gross brown liquid, which was part of what made it unappealing to young people and certainly wasn't very discreet. It's difficult to hide that. With Zyn and with some of these new nicotine pouches, you don't have to do that. So swallowing the saliva that's generated with these nicotine pouches might irritate the throat a little bit, but you don't technically have to spit. It's designed to minimize saliva production compared to these older versions. So that does make it a lot easier for youth to use it in a discreet way. So these small pouches contain nicotine, flavorings, sweeteners, and just like traditional chewing tobacco placed between the lip and the gums to absorb the nicotine. These are common brands that you might see today. Zyn, probably the most popular, but there's also On, Rogue, Velo, Free, and I saw On being advertised in the airport as a way to use nicotine on a plane, because obviously you can't vape or smoke on a plane, but they were saying if you needed your nicotine fix, you could use On a plane. So That's kind of unfortunate. The long-term health effects of these are undergoing further research, but we have known for decades the harms of smokeless chewing tobacco, and we know that nicotine in and of itself is a highly addictive chemical. Nicotine harms brain development in the areas responsible for attention, learning, and impulse control. We know that nicotine itself has adverse effects on the cardiac system, respiratory system, reproductive systems, and on our immune system. We know that nicotine addiction can onset very quickly, even without daily use, especially in young people who are more sensitive to the effects. And so moving on to our next commonly used substance is Delta-8. This is one that you might have heard of. It is a psychoactive substance that's found in the cannabis plant. So it's found in what we would consider the normal marijuana plant. The typical cannabinoid that is psychoactive in cannabis is Delta-9. That would be kind of the normal THC that we're used to. And so Delta-8 is just another one of these naturally occurring cannabinoids in the plant. It's found naturally in the plant in very small concentrations. So it's there naturally, there's just not that much of it. And so they've been making products out of Delta-8 by going through some synthetic processes to up the concentration of it. So they basically kind of derive it from the plant and then make products out of it that are in really high concentrations of Delta-8. Delta-10 is another cannabinoid that's being made into products. It's even newer and kind of less studied than Delta-8, but again, it's one of those naturally occurring cannabinoids that's in a really small concentration naturally in the plants, but they're pulling it out of the plant and making products with it. And so what we know about Delta-8 is that these products are made with this conversion process that involves a lot of chemicals, it's a kind of a long process and has some harmful byproducts of this synthesis process. Delta-8 has not been evaluated or approved for any use by the FDA. It's not deemed safe in any context. It has a very similar high effect, similar to traditional Delta-9. The reason that it's becoming popular, it's just something new and different and exciting. Some places will advertise Delta-8 as being slightly less psychoactive as Delta-9. We know that a lot of marijuana products these days have very high potency THC, and so sometimes some of these Delta-8 products are advertised as being less psychoactive, so kind of a less intense high as some of these high potency Delta-9 products. But, who can really tell? In 2024, so last year, about 12% of high school seniors reported having used Delta-8 products in the last year. And so that's a substantial proportion. So there are a lot of young people, seniors at least, that are using these Delta-8 products. We don't know a whole lot about what Delta-8 does. We know it's similar chemically to Delta-9, and obviously the effects of THC in marijuana have been studied for a long time. The adverse effects, so some of the negative side effects of Delta-8 seem to be pretty similar to high potency Delta-9, including, lethargy, uncoordinated movements, slurred speech, increasing heart rate, sometimes, like getting too high, those feelings of paranoia and anxiousness, low blood pressure, difficulty breathing, and sedation. So kind of the standard things we see with getting too high in Delta-9. But it's very new. There's not been a lot of research on this, and so we don't really know if there's any different adverse effects with Delta-8 compared to Delta-9. We don't know if that synthetic process of synthesizing Delta-8 from the THC from this cannabis plant, we don't know if there's any effects of that. We just really don't know a whole lot about it, which is what's concerning. Another trend that we want to be cognizant of is it's called Borgs. This is If you haven't heard of this, it's very popular on college campuses right now. So maybe a little less popular among the high school or younger age groups. But a Borg is a blackout rage gallon. So this is a gallon-sized container that is filled with kind of your own cocktail mix, usually water, vodka, or some other alcohol, those little water flavor enhancers, electrolyte powders, and then you kind of carry around your own individual gallon. So it's a new version of the jungle juice trend, or VAT, if you had heard of that. From, a couple decades ago. And this became popular, fueled by instances of VAT or jungle juice being spiked or laced with unwanted drugs. So now the trend is to just carry your own personal jungle juice vat. And so a lot of young people, college students, believe that this is a safer way to drink to excess because you are at least in control of what's in it. You have a cap on it, you're carrying it with you, so you are much less likely to imbibe kind of laced jungle juice or vat. The problem is these contain a lot of alcohol, and putting electrolyte powder in your Borg is not going to save you from a hangover and the effects of a really intense binge. They usually contain much more alcohol than is considered a standard drink, usually a lot more than what's considered a binge drink. There was an interview that I saw of students in New Jersey said that they measured their Borg and they had put 17 shots in it. So that's, drinking to absolute excess. These are really popular on social media. These are popular in kind of pre-gaming, before college sports event, for day parties, day drinking, festivals. That's kind of our concern around Borgs. So not so much high schooler and younger. We know another problem with this, a tale as old as time, combining caffeine and alcohol can lead to additional harmful health outcomes. There seems to always be the new trend of how young people are putting caffeine and alcohol together. If we remember the days of the original Four Loko, this is this, again, kind of to an nth degree. We know that caffeine hides the effects of alcohol, leading to potentially drinking more. The risk for blacking out is much higher when you combine caffeine and alcohol, heart and liver problems. And just in general, we know that binge drinking can have severe health consequences in the short term. When it comes to Borgs, there was a kind of infamous weekend where 40 students at the University of Massachusetts were hospitalized after drinking Borgs. So this is kind of starting as a college drinking trend for tailgating and day drinking, but certainly can be very dangerous. Something else that we want to be cognizant of is galaxy gas. So this is nitrous oxide, so laughing gas, what we're used to hearing about in a dentist office. It is a colorless, sweet smelling gas. It's used in a lot of legitimate industries. So there's certainly uses for it in doctor's offices and dentist offices, food industries, automotive industries. We know that this new one, Galaxy Gas, pictured here on the right, is a brand name that comes from a company in Atlanta. And they sell whipped cream dispensers. When used as intended, in a doctor's office or in your car, nitrous oxide is safe. It's not inherently harmful. It can be inhaled through these whipped cream canisters and other types of canisters to get high. Provides a short-term feeling of happiness, relaxation, giddiness, kind of disassociation, where you feel like you're somewhat outside or floating outside of your body. And we know that inhalants are not something new. People have been doing whippets and things similar to this for a long time. But this specific version is new, and it's being marketed and promoted as a fun thing for young people to do. At least in New York, where Linda and I and our team is based, in 2021, New York passed a law prohibiting people from buying these younger than 21, um, these whipped cream canisters that contain the gas. There's been a lot of TikTok and social media videos of young people using these. They portray it as like a very kind of funny thing because we know it can change the way your voice sounds and it makes you feel very giddy and you laugh a lot. And so there's been a lot of videos using this specific brand, the Galaxy Gas brand from Atlanta. And Galaxy Gas, the brand specifically, they market it as being used only for food industry. But the CEO, CFO of this company also owns a chain of smoke shops around the US. And so this picture here of Galaxy Gas is in a smoke shop in Manhattan. If it was only meant for pastry chefs who are creating art with whipped cream, why would it be sold in a smoke shop, you know? A quick look at the company's website. There's a lot of things that are very attractive to teens on this website. They have merch, they have t-shirts, they have prize giveaways, bottle openers. It's certainly it doesn't give the impression that it's only meant for chefs. I'll say that. So as we know, it's becoming more popular on social media, especially on the East Coast around Atlanta and slowly moving towards the West. These are easily bought in retail stores, online, acquired at parties or festivals. Inhalants are somewhat different than other substances in the fact that they're most commonly used by younger adolescents, and use tends to go down as people get older. So when we think of inhalant use, we're most concerned about middle schoolers. In 2024, last year, about 4% of eighth graders had used any form of inhalant in the past year. And that number is higher than those in 10th or 12th grade who talk about having used inhalants. To order from the Galaxy Gas website, you have to be 21. Some states are trying to make the age 18 to buy these canisters in person, but in most places, it's legal for anyone to buy these canisters. I know Amazon online just recently made it so that you can't buy these online, but it is still a big problem in trying to get these out of the hands of young people. This pop-up on the right is what comes up when you access the Galaxy Gas website. I don't know of any young person that would read that whole pop-up, but basically they're trying to say that this is not for the purposes of getting high. The effects of NOS, nitrous oxide, short-term, that euphoria, dizziness, can cause a headache or nausea, difficulty moving or thinking clearly. There is the potential for frostbite around the mouth. So using these canisters, it does get very, very cold. And so you can damage the tissues of the mouth. Long term, it can cause severe vitamin B12 deficiencies, which can lead to nerve damage, memory loss, problems with coordination. Inhaling nitrous oxide can lead to a lack of oxygen reaching the brain, what's called hypoxia. And this can cause fainting, seizures, or even death. So this is very dangerous. A lot of videos on social media portray this as being a very kind of fun, short-term, safe thing to do with your friends, but it can be deadly immediately. If someone is using nitrous oxide and is showing any signs of these difficulties, very important to get emergency help immediately, especially if someone is having difficulty breathing or gasping for air. And misuse of these has become so prevalent that there's been a lot of celebrities and famous people like SZA who are trying to speak out against it and raise awareness and get kids kind of to realize that this is dangerous and not something cool to do. But this is a really important one for young people to know the dangers of, because it is that middle school age that's at highest risk for using these, and it can be really detrimental. Okay, so moving on to some of the new emerging substances. Again, some of these are more commonly known than others. And a lot of these are not super prevalent among young people yet, but important things for us to kind of stay abreast of. The first is xylazine. This is probably one that most of us have heard of. Also known as tranquilizer, tranq. So xylazine is a non-opioid sedative. This is not a controlled substance in the US, so it's not approved for any human use. Therefore, it's not regulated for human use. It is used in veterinary offices as a tranquilizer. When it comes to humans that use this, it's rarely used by itself. It's much more commonly mixed with other substances like cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. It can prolong the high of fentanyl and other substances, which is why it's mixed in. It's usually injected, but it can come in a powder that can be swallowed or snorted. It's often taken unintentionally, so a lot of individuals are not seeking this out on purpose. Most individuals who come in contact with xylazine are unaware that it's in the substances that they're using. In the same way that fentanyl is often mixed into other opioids or these fake pharmaceutical pills to reduce the cost for dealers, the same kind of thing is happening with xylazine. Xylazine is cheap to procure and can really extend the drug supply for illegal dealers. It's important to know that because it's not an opioid, naloxone is not going to reverse the effects of xylazine. We know naloxone is our overdose reversal drug. But because xylazine is so often mixed with opioids, if it seems like someone is in an overdose situation, but we think it's just xylazine, naloxone should still be given because naloxone will reverse the effects of the opioid, even though it might not touch what's happening with the xylazine. You'll hear me say this multiple times in this section, in any type of suspected overdose situation, no matter what you think the substance is, always give naloxone, give Narcan in any situation. The effects of xylazine are, remember, it's a tranquilizer, so sedation is really the first one. Can lead to difficulties breathing, dangerously low blood pressure, and slowed heart rate. The hallmark of xylazine use is these wounds, flesh wounds, that can very easily become infected. People can become addicted to this, so it can lead to withdrawal, and you can overdose on xylazine, and it can be fatal. The flesh wounds that are very common with xylazine use have unfortunately led to stigmatizing media monikers around xylazine, calling it a zombie drug and other really kind of horrific names. It's kind of interesting that the wounds don't usually show up at the injection site, which is different than typical injection drug use. And it seems that they don't really know why that is the case. It's incredibly important for people who are in these situations and have been using xylazine and are getting these wounds to get wound care to reduce the chance of infection or amputation. But the stigmatization of injection drug use is a massive barrier to people getting the help that they need. Because of the intense sedation effects of xylazine, if someone is given Narcan in an overdose situation, you always want to be doing rescue breaths to try to restore breathing. So the prevalence of xylazine across the US. Of DEA seizures, so the DEA will seize drugs through, they are doing raids and things. In 2023, about 30% of fentanyl powder and about 6% of fentanyl pills contained xylazine. The illegal drug supply being laced with xylazine started in the Northeast Mid-Atlantic states in 2015. I think a lot of us probably heard about Philadelphia being a hot spot for xylazine. And then since then has been slowly moving south and west since then. So you can see on this map here, the legend is kind of hard to make out, but the darker the state appears, the higher percent of drug seizures contained xylazine in that area. And so you can see the darker states are typically on the East Coast, but slowly moving further west. It's also important to know that when it comes to these data, not all states are testing for xylazine at the same rates. So a lot of states are bumping up how much they're testing for xylazine because they want to know if it's in their drug supply. But not everyone's testing at the same rates, so it is difficult to compare. But again, this is not commonly used by young people. We don't see a lot of this in teens that we work with, but something that we want to be aware of. The next group of substances I want to talk about are what are called nitazenes. This is a newly emerging group of synthetic opioids. So when we think of synthetic opioids, we're thinking of things like fentanyl. This group was first synthesized in the 1950s, but was never approved for medical use. The first nitazene emergence coming up illegally was reported in 2019 in Europe, and that was one called isotonanitazene. And now we're up to about 13 types as of 2023. These, unfortunately, are 10 to 40 times more potent than fentanyl. And if we remember, fentanyl is about 100 times more potent than morphine. So these are very potent opioids, depending on the formulation. These are increasingly being identified in combination with fentanyl, heroin, and cocaine in lab submissions that have gone to the FDA. The reported prevalence of these is still very low compared to fentanyl. But it is important for us to know that, fentanyl is not fentanyl and even carfentanil, they're not the final boss of synthetic opioids. There's always going to be more ones that pop up that are more potent. So these are being implicated in overdose deaths in the US, but it's not commonly tested for because it is still very new. Fentanyl test strips will not detect these opioids. It's also important to note that an overdose involving these nitazenes, because they are so much more potent than fentanyl, can be reversed with naloxone because it is an opioid, but it might need multiple doses due to how potent they are. And so because of this, the prevalence of some of these higher potency opioids is leading to the development of higher dose naloxone. So that's a silver lining here. So the prevalence of these is not super well understood because not everybody's testing for it because it is so new and is seemingly a pretty, not a heavy hitter like fentanyl these days. The difficulty in trying to get a handle on the legality of these is the way that the scheduling works with the DEA is they schedule by chemical composition. So, they test for and they find one type of this nitazene, they make it illegal, and then the dealers will very, cunningly change the chemical signature just very briefly, make a brand new nitazene that then is no longer technically illegal because it's not the same chemical composition. So they can make these small changes to the chemical structure, create technically a new chemical, even though it reacts very similarly in the body. And so they're constantly finding these legal loopholes to kind of get through to avoid detection. These, once again, kind of starting on the East Coast and moving west. In 2021, there was some overdose deaths in Tennessee, where they found about 12% of their overdose deaths involved what was called metonitazene, so one of these nitazenes. Since 2019, there's been about 2,400 reports of nitazenes, which is a very low number when we think about all of the opioids that are being used across the country. Nitazenes were detected in 0 overdose deaths in Arizona in 2023, for example. So not yet a problem in Arizona, but something that we want to be aware of. The next one, which is one that I'm sure we've all heard of, is ketamine. And so ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic with some hallucinogenic effects. It is short-acting and it's used in both kind of medical settings, therapeutic settings in some cases, and veterinary settings. Common nicknames for it include Special K, Vitamin K, Kit Kat, Super K. Anything with a K in it is likely to be ketamine. So ketamine comes as a clear liquid or a white or an off-white powder. It is often illegally in combination with MDMA, amphetamines, methamphetamine, or cocaine. It's a popular party drug, and so often mixed with other party drugs. The effects of ketamine include sedation, kind of paralyzing immobility, pain relief, amnesia. It does have some hallucinogenic properties. People can become agitated and people can lose consciousness. The hallucinations induced by ketamine only last about 30 minutes to an hour, which often makes it more attractive to some people than something like psilocybin, mushrooms, or LSD that have the potential to last a lot longer. With ketamine, there is the potential for hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, HPPD, where the hallucinations are lasting a lot longer. It can last for weeks after taking the substance, which is certainly a very scary thing to have happen. When it comes to ketamine use, this is more popular than some of the other opioids that I discussed earlier. In 2024, so last year, about 1% of high school seniors said that they had used ketamine in the last 12 months, which 1% doesn't seem like that much, but it is a large number of students. The perception of harm around ketamine is shifting recently as it's becoming more utilized for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, which is not FDA approved. There is a nasal spray of a ketamine-related substance called esketamine that is FDA approved for treatment-resistant depression. Esketamine, that nasal spray, is not what we're seeing in the ketamine clinics that are popping up kind of all over the US. That is usually drip ketamine, which is not FDA approved. But when it comes to ketamine assisted psychotherapy, there is promise that ketamine does have effects when combined with psychotherapy, when done under the strict supervision of a medical professional, that some people are seeing reductions in their pain, anxiety, depressive symptoms, suicidality, and it can help treat their substance use disorders. So this does have legitimate therapeutic uses that people are seeing a lot of positive effects from. But this is not just people using it recreationally and saying that their life is improving. When it comes to recreational use, ketamine is often laced or used in conjunction with opioids. And so it is possible to overdose on ketamine, and Narcan is not going to reverse a ketamine overdose, again, because it's not an opioid. But again, the vast majority of overdoses are conjunction, a cocktail of substances, so always use Narcan in an overdose situation. And we might remember that ketamine kind of was getting a lot of media attention after the actor Matthew Perry's death. He had been in treatment for depression and addiction with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, but he had recently switched physicians and was receiving ketamine from a dealer, not from a medical professional, to use outside of that medical context, which unfortunately led to his death. The next one I want to talk about is what's commonly known as pink cocaine, or 2C. And it's named this after the 2CB class of psychedelic drugs. 2CB are club drugs that are psychoactive and hallucinogenic, very similar to mescaline. but are synthetically produced, so not natural. The problem is that 2CB, the old 2C, is kind of out of fashion and difficult to find these days. So what we have now, it's not cocaine and it's not actually 2CB. So the original compound became a lot harder to get. Drug organizations started shifting to a drug cocktail, which they then just dyed pink and have been selling as pink cocaine and calling it 2C, even though it's not that original 2CB psychoactive substance. Usually a combination of things, often including ketamine and MDMA, and colored with pink food dye. Some have been found to include opioids, bath salts, LSD, mescaline. So truly, you never know what you're getting if you are someone who is procuring pink cocaine. Often a mixture of both central nervous system depressants and stimulants, which we know is dangerous. This is not super common in the US. Since 2020, DEA has seized less than 1,000 of these pink powders. 4 of them actually contained real 2CB psychoactive elements, and all the rest were kind of other substances, a big mixture. To put that into perspective, within that same time frame, DEA seized 180 million fentanyl pills. So this is not super common. It is typically found where it is found, it's going to be areas with active club scenes. So Miami, Los Angeles, and New York typically are areas where this is found. So because it's not one specific substance, really impossible to know what it's going to be without getting it tested in a lab. We do know often has ketamine in it, and ketamine can, the effects can include delirium, memory problems, psychosis, breathing issues. And the effects of ketamine and other tranquilizers like that are more dangerous when mixed with other substance, as is the case in this powder most of the time. Once again, in case of any suspected overdose, call 911, administer Narcan, and start rescue breaths. Another one that I wanted to add to this section, because it is becoming increasingly popular, is kratom. So kratom is a tree native to Southeast Asia. The products are derived from its leaves and marketed as herbal supplements. Kratom, the leaves from this tree have been used in traditional Southeast Asian medicines for thousands of years. So this is not a new synthetic product. Commonly ingested as capsules, powders that can be mixed into food and drinks. You can brew the leaves as tea, or you can get liquid extracts of it. This is, in the US, not approved for any use by the FDA, so it is not federally regulated. People who do use it find that it has very opioid-like effects, but also some stimulating effects. Anecdotally, people find that it reduces their pain, that it can reduce their anxiety and depression symptoms. It can reduce cravings for opioids and other drugs that they might be addicted to. And so in states where it's legal, you can find it in gas stations, smoke shops. There's even dedicated kratom bars and cafes. I know that we have them here in New York. I live a couple blocks from one. It's often touted as a safer, more natural substance to replace, opioid use or other stimulant use. The problem is that because it is not federally regulated, there are a lot of synthetic kratom products on the market. I looked up the laws in Arizona, and Arizona in 2019 passed the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which designates it as a dietary supplement, which the FDA rejects on a federal level. But at least this law made it illegal for minors to purchase kratom, and it made it illegal to sell high-potency kratom products in Arizona. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's enforced very strictly. Many synthetic kratom products get around that law by not being pure leaf kratom, so they can be higher potency and not as easily regulated. The National Institute on Drug Abuse has identified several safety issues with kratom. Because it is not regulated, it's very difficult to know if you're getting pure kratom or that it might be contaminated. As is common with other unregulated herbal supplements, there have been instances of contamination with heavy metals and harmful bacteria, leading to harmful consequences, not due to the kratom itself, but because it's in the way that it's manufactured has been contaminated with something harmful. There are potential for adverse effects with kratom use. Even pure kratom can cause nausea, dizziness, confusion, high blood pressure, vomiting. These mild side effects are fairly common for people and depends how much you take and how quickly you take it. More serious side effects like seizures, extremely high blood pressure, slow breathing are rare but can happen. The long-term health and safety effects are not understood. There's not been a lot of research into the effects of kratom on the human body. It has been linked to a small number of deaths in the United States. Very small numbers of these are due to kratom only. A lot of them are people mixing kratom with other substances. So between 2011 and 2017, there were 11 deaths associated with kratom exposure, including 2 from only kratom. So it is possible to overdose and die just from kratom use. It's unlikely, it is pretty rare when it happens, but it's not impossible. There is a lot of inconsistencies in reporting kratom death and overdose. If you Google kratom danger, things like that, it's very easy to find local publications that are touting like thousands of kratom deaths over the past decade. And so it's really important to fact check these numbers, especially if you're going to report some of these numbers to your clients, to parents, to young people. So always default to data from vetted national sources if possible. Most reported kratom deaths are due to a mixing of substances or these synthetic kratom products. In 2023, for instance, kratom was detected in 21 drug overdose deaths in Arizona. So that doesn't mean that kratom was the cause of the deadly overdose. It just means that there were 21 people who died of a drug overdose in Arizona. And when they did the toxicology, kratom was something that they had used. So we want to be aware of the dangers of this, but we also don't want to over-exaggerate this and lose some of our credibility. And this picture on the right is what kratom capsules might look like. They often come with the label saying that it's like 7-OHMZ, things like that. Kind of a similar one is tianeptine, which has been unfortunately dubbed gas station heroin. It's commonly available in gas stations and bodegas and smoke shops. There's a lot of different brands. You might see some as Tiana Red, Neptune's Elixir, Zaza. This has been approved in other countries as a treatment for major depressive disorder, but has never been approved for any use in the US. It can, similar to kratom, have opioid-like effects and associated dependence and withdrawal symptoms. So people can become addicted to tianeptine. Importantly, it is found to induce suicidal ideation in people younger than 25. So this is dangerous for young people. Other risks include confusion, seizures, shortness of breath, and these are exacerbated and exaggerated when used with alcohol or antidepressants. We don't really have any good prevalence data for this, so we don't know how common it is for young people to use, but we do know across the country that it's very common that young people will see this in gas stations and smoke shops. There was a nationwide recall of one brand of tianeptine due to poisonings in January of last year. There's some evidence that naloxone might be effective in treating tianeptine toxicity because it does bind to the same mu receptor in the brain. As far as I know, I looked this up, there's no tianeptine regulation in Arizona, as of November of last year. This is another one where it's really difficult to navigate the legality, where because it's not approved for any use, it's technically illegal to market or sell these drugs, but it's technically not a federally controlled substance. There are some states that are cracking down and are trying to ban all substances containing tianeptine, but it's difficult to get a handle on. As of 2023, or in the year 2023, there were about 400 calls to US poison control centers due to kind of side effects or bad consequences of using tianeptine. And I found there were some overdose deaths in New Jersey where people were using tianeptine and combining it with marijuana and alcohol, and that had led to an overdose death. But the effects of this not well understood. And you can see on the picture on the right here, it can come in kind of these capsules. It can come in liquid form. It's all very heavily advertised, and it talks about increasing focus and enhancing your mood and relieving your stress, but doesn't say very explicitly what it is. And finally, I wanted to touch on bromazolone, which is a synthetic benzodiazepine, first created in the late 70s, but never approved for therapeutic use. Illicitly popped up for the first time in Sweden in 2016. It's most often detected alongside fentanyl or other opioids. In a pill form, it's called benzodope. So again, naloxone will act on the opioids that it's mixed with, but it's not going to act on the effects of the benzodiazepines themselves. This is becoming increasingly found in counterfeit pills. In New York and New Jersey, there's been instances where people are buying pills either online or through a fake pharmacy or through social media, and they think they're buying a legitimate prescription benzodiazepine, so something like Xanax. But it ends up being laced with this or other opioids and can be deadly. This was detected in 19 overdose deaths in Arizona in 2023. So it is here in Arizona, but still pretty low prevalence. And so I just have a few minutes left, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but I did want to ask if this section, if these are things that you've heard of in your community, or if there's other trends, other emerging substances in your community that you've heard of that I didn't touch on. You can use, since we can't unmute, if there's anything that this made you think of, please put it in the chat. We'd like to hear it. But I'm gonna keep moving in the interest of time because I want to leave on a happy note. I think this can be kind of saddening to hear about all of these new things that we don't know how they affect the human body. We don't know how prevalent they are. So our response is the same. We're trying to prevent use of these things. And so the importance of early prevention cannot be overstated. Prevention that is early and broad and proactive, that's working upstream to prevent all types of substance use risk behavior. The risk and the protective factors that we're intervening on are largely the same, regardless of the substance or the behavior that we're trying to prevent. So with all of these new emerging substances, it can feel overwhelming to know what to do to keep young people safe. I learned about a lot of these at a seminar given by the DEA. And when they mentioned nitazines that are 40 times more potent than fentanyl, the whole crowd just groaned like, oh, what can we do? It always seems like there's something new for us to fight against. And that's true and will likely always be true. The drug landscape is going to continue to change always. But when we go back to this idea of early prevention, we can really have some hope. Our upstream approach, trying to prevent risk behavior before it happens, it doesn't change with new trends, you know? The protective factors that we want to bolster and the risk factors that we want to mitigate are the same, regardless of whether we're trying to prevent marijuana use, violence, sexual risk behavior, xylazine use, tianeptine, it's all the same. So we don't have to change our approach with every new substance that comes on the market. So here are our risk factors that we want to intervene on. We want to try to prevent adverse childhood experiences. We want to prevent low school attachment. We want to get ahead of mental health and behavioral problems before they get worse. We want to reduce bullying. We want to reduce discrimination. We want to reduce high crime in neighborhoods, things like this. Our protective factors, we want to have stable, nurturing, supportive homes. We want to have parents who are really well versed in effective parenting skills. We want to have good extracurricular activities, effective policies, safe neighborhoods, all of these things that can really reduce the risk for a young person. Because we know that these risks and protective factors really cascade through time. So we know that risk factors in infancy and toddlerhood will turn into risk factors in early and middle childhood, which will then lead to risk factors in the teenage years and the risk factors in adulthood. It really just is a cascade that they build on each other and compound over time. And so we really want to focus on resilience. We know that if kids are resilient when it comes to their mental health, their physical health, their family bonds, their school and community connection, that we can really bolster them against all of these substance use threats. And the big reminder is that not using is really the norm. You know, we're talking about all of these substances, but not using substances is the norm among young people. The vast majority of 8th graders, over half of 10th graders, and almost 40% of seniors are lifetime abstainers, having never used any substance in their life. And we know that this is increasing year after year. I want to briefly highlight our resources. A lot of this information is present on Partnership's website, drugfree.org. If you want to learn more about pink cocaine or the Borg drinking trend or Delta 8, we have resources on all of these, free to use. I also wanted to highlight SAMHSA's Drug Abuse Warning Network. It's called DAWN. This is a public health surveillance system that uses emergency department data and is an early warning system for emerging drug threats based on what people are presenting with in the emergency room. The CDC also has really helpful data dashboards. The Unintentional Drug Overdose Reporting System, SUDRS. As an example, I showed just a brief snippet of the Arizona data that you can find. So you can go by state, go by year, and find a lot of really useful data on all of these different substances. Finally, the DEA has enduring and emerging threat reports. This is where, you know, I got that xylazine map from. They release these reports on a somewhat regular basis, talking about emerging threats and substance use. So that's where I got a lot of my information about xylazine and nitazenes and what the DEA is doing about them. Finally, support services from Partnership. We have our helpline, support groups, and personalized text messaging programs, all free, available in English and Spanish on drugfree.org. And if you ever have questions about Partnership's resources, you can always email Linda and myself, and we can help point you in the right direction. It looks like I ran up right against our time limit, but I can stay on for a few minutes if people have questions, but by all means, feel free to reach out to myself or Linda, and we can email back and forth with any questions that you might have after this. But thank you so much for joining me. Sorry, that was a lot of information all at once, but hopefully some of it was helpful.
Thank you so much, Corey. I know we definitely got a lot out of that information. I know we're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat too, and I know we do have your contact information, so we will be in touch if we have any follow-up questions. But thank you so much.
Thank you.